All right, well, welcome back to Beginning with the Basics. We're on week 5, it's our third week in Genesis. So we're finally on day 2, so that's a good thing. We spent some time again talking about the importance of a day, why that's an important topic for us as Christians. And then last week we just spent talking about day 1. There's just so much there with the initial state of the universe, God being the transcendent God outside the universe, how he's creating this world for us, and that, even starting day 1 when the earth was formless and void, we see creation being molded for mankind's use. So where day 1 leaves off, we have the heavens and the earth created. At some point, not technically mentioned in Genesis, but talked about in Proverbs 8. A circle was drawn around the face of the deep, establishing the boundaries of the earth. At the same time, light was created, and God caused light to only be on one side of the earth, even though the source of the light was not mentioned. And then there was evening and morning, day 1. So let's jump into day 2. We're going to talk about day 2, and hopefully we'll get through day 3 today. I don't think we'll get much further than that, though. But day 2, starting in verse 6. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and it was so. And he called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Okay, so the big thing we see here is this thing called the expanse. In some versions, it's translated as firmament. And whatever we translate as firmament, expanse, it's being spread out between two groupings of waters, really. The waters above and the waters below. So the word firmament or expanse, it's not the same word as heaven or sky or anything like that. The word in Hebrew means something that is being spread out. And actually, the way it's being spread out, if we were to actually look at the verb for this noun, it's being used as a noun here for firmament. But the verb is to pound something repeatedly to spread it out. The idea is like if you had like clay or something, you're pounding on it with a hammer, you'd spread it out. Or metals, if we were trying to put metals into sheets, especially back in those days, you'd pound it out. A lot of the overlay of structures was gold pounded out into thin sheets. It's the same idea here. So the verb here is talked several times in the Old Testament, not just here in Genesis, but it's always talking about creation. 2 verses that I found very helpful to look at this. First one's in Job, second one's in Psalms. So Job 37:18. It says, "Can you like him spread out the skies, hard as a cast metal mirror?" And the spread out there is the verb. Again, this is the verb that we translate when we're using it as a noun into firmament or expanse. And then Psalm 136, verse 6 says, "To him who spread out the earth above the waters, for his steadfast love endures forever." So again, it's this idea of the spreading out, and it's involving with creation here. Now, there's 2 other ones in Isaiah that I want to look at as well. And I want to make a note here before I read them. It talks about stretching out and then spreading out, and those are actually different verbs. Okay, the spreading out is the verb that we're looking at. The stretching out's different. The stretching out is actually more of this idea of being pulled apart or pulled to stretch out versus pounding out. So stretching is the pulling, the spreading would be the idea that we're looking at in Genesis 1. So Isaiah 42:5 says, "Thus says God, the Lord who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people and on it, whose spirit to those who walk in it." And then Isaiah 44, just 2 chapters later, verse 24, it says, "Thus says the Lord your Redeemer who formed you in your womb, I am the Lord who made all things, who alone stretched out the heavens, who spread out the earth by myself." So again, this idea of firmament is the noun form. So we do see the verb form in the scriptures, but the noun is something that is spread out to a thin state. Now, the word is actually used more than once in Genesis 1. Now, we see it used here. We also see it used in verse 17 and verse 20. And what we notice in that in 17, it's used for outer space. Because in 17, it's talking about where the sun, the moon, the stars are being put in the firmament or in the expanse. So there's that there. So it is talking about the space, but also talks about the sky or what we call the atmosphere in verse 20. Because it's talking about when the birds are created, they're created in the firmament, and that's above the earth. In the ESV, it's the expanse. So it says, in my translation, it says above the earth, across the expanse of the heavens. That's where the birds fly. So when we look at this, we're saying what is this actually talking about? Is this talking about would be the sky or space? When we look at how the verb is used and how it's used here, it's probably talking about the sky or the atmosphere. Isaiah contrasts the heavens above being pulled out versus the earth being spread out. And Job connects the verb spread out with a noun that's different that's used for the heavens. When Job says spread out the skies, that's not the same as what we translate as heaven. That one literally means clouds or something that's cloudy. So this expanse on day 2 is probably the atmosphere we're looking at. But that leads to some interesting questions. So it means that the atmosphere, when it was created, separated the waters above from the waters below. And so what kind of waters are we actually talking here? Are these the same? Are they different? The word in the Hebrew is the same everywhere in Genesis 1. Whenever it's mentioned waters, it's the same word, mayim. And so we're talking about the same kind of thing here. There's no difference. Sometimes when we translate, we see in the Bible, we translate different native words into the same English word because we don't really have a difference for them, but that's not the case here. It's the same word in the Hebrew all throughout Genesis 1 when it talks about water. So what we actually have here is water that was separated out, and the word separate has the idea of separating things out according to purpose, not according to kind or anything, but purpose. So what's being separated, the waters, we're going to have 2 sets of waters that have different purposes for God's plan of how the earth is to function. And separated, we see the separation of day and night. It's the same verb there. Again, day and night both have a purpose for how the earth functions, but they have a separate purpose, but they both contribute to the whole. The word separate is also used in the books of law, usually talking about separating clean from unclean, holy and common. It's also used to talk about separating Israel from other nations. So again, in all these cases, we're talking about the same kinds of things together, but it's just what's it being used for. Israel and other nations, they're both groups of people, but Israel separated God versus the other nations, so they're separated away. The clean and unclean, they're all animals, but the clean are separated versus the unclean, and such like that. So what are these waters? Well, the waters below, pretty clear. That's what would be oceans. What would be on day 3 would make up the oceans and the seas. So really the question is, what's the waters above? What were they? Now, there's 3 common views on what it is. Now, again, we say that it should be water, but what exactly does it mean by this? Well, if we're having water above the atmosphere, some say that this was actually a solid, almost a layer of water suspended above the atmosphere, like water in its water liquid form. Others say that it was water that was spread out into a vapor above the atmosphere, so it's in its vaporous form, a gaseous form. And then 3, there's the view that it's just talking about waters suspended in the clouds. Now, if we look at these 3, all of them have some some complications to them. So let's take a look at these three real quick and then talk about what's most likely going on. First of all, the solid dome of water. If the dome was solid water, a liquid, the biggest problem is that in its liquid form, if it was thick enough to be a significant amount of water, it would actually greatly distort the light coming in from whatever source. I mean, the sun wasn't created yet. Whatever light source before the sun or the sun itself, it would impede that and distort it. So we wouldn't actually get the sun like we would now. A spread out vapor would explain many things. Spread out vapor, again, would be in a gaseous state. And in a gaseous state, the water particles don't distort light nearly as much as their liquid state for the same amount of water because they're not interacting with each other as much. One of the problems here, though, and it's a similar one to the dome of water, is that any mass that's above us, like the air pressure that we talk about for the atmosphere, what that really is all the air above us pulling down and putting pressure on us, pulling down by gravity and putting pressure on us. So if we had more substance up there, more mass, that would be more pressure on us. And so it would mean that there'd be a significant amount of extra pressure all on the Earth. The vapor above would still be resting on the atmosphere, and that would be pushing the atmosphere down, and then the atmosphere would again have more pressure on the humans alive at the time. And part of the problem with this is changes in pressure can greatly affect how things like our respiration work and other bodily functions. And the biggest problem is we know very little about how it would. So it could turn out to be fine, but it's something we really need to explore. And then the third one, clouds. Okay, so this actually has two issues here. First of all, if we're talking about clouds, this is talking about, the passage is talking about waters above the atmosphere. So if we're talking about clouds, that's not above the atmosphere, that's in the atmosphere. And you might say, okay, that's just the use of the language. Clouds appear to be in the sky. But one, we're not talking about a figurative narrative here. It's being very literal in what it's talking about. Very careful in the words that's being chosen. And second, it's not like Israel wouldn't know about clouds, the nation of Israel. This is being written to the nation of Israel. They would have known what clouds are. They'd seen God in a pillar of a cloud. They'd seen, fog come down on Mount Sinai. So this isn't something where they'd be like, oh yeah, all clouds are above the sky. They know how clouds work. Okay, they know that they can come down and they're not above the sky. The second issue with clouds is that if, again, this is a significant amount of water to mention, there'd be enough clouds to, again, block the sun. Okay, the clouds, we know clouds are tiny droplets of water, and it's different from water vapor. Water vapor, the molecules themselves are separate. Clouds, they're actually clumped into small droplets. And while water vapor would be mostly invisible, the droplets have enough shape and interaction with themselves, again, to distort it. That's why you look outside, you can't see through clouds. Well, if you actually have clouds in your sky, So which one of these is most likely? It's probably actually the vapor. Again, the biggest problem with the vapor is that we know very little about the study of excess air pressure. We call that hyperbaric pressure. And so we know very little about hyperbaric respiration and things like that. Most of what we do know is about diving, and they always use hyperbaric with pure oxygen environments, which would not be in the pre-flood state. They would actually be in atmosphere. So again, it's most likely vapor, but there's still some questions we need to answer, mostly that we just need to kind of study the science behind to figure that out. So now, in any of these forms that we mentioned above, one of the benefits of having a water above is that it actually will block out a lot of the more dangerous radiation from the sun, namely ultraviolet rays. There's other rays that would be blocked out as well. We kind of call that as a whole cosmic radiation. And so even vapor would add this extra layer of protection around the Earth. And it would mitigate this effect on our bodies. It would lower the amount of mutations. It would also, interestingly enough, lower the rates at which certain elemental isotopes are formed. You've probably heard of carbon-14 in the term carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 is an isotope that we use. We find them in things that were living at one point and then they died, and we find this amount of carbon-14 in them. Well, carbon-14 is actually formed in the upper atmosphere by solar radiation. And so we get these radiation bombarding particles in the upper atmosphere, and it turns some of them into carbon-14. And with a layer like this, the carbon-14 in the early creation would actually be, the formation would be a lot less. So interestingly enough, any of these explanations would actually indicate far less of these isotopes, which means since we date things by how much carbon-14 we find in them, if there would be less to begin with, when we dated using carbon-14, the things we date with it would seem far older than they actually are. And this is another thing, and we'll talk about this more as we go along, but a lot of dating time processes that we look at with geology and such assume that the universe, the Earth, has been mostly constant for the last so many millions of years. And so if we say, well, they might not have been, that actually throws a lot of them into question. Okay, so we talked about, okay, there's water above, is most likely some sort of vapor layer, okay? The next question is, what happened to these waters? Because we obviously don't have that around our world today. And there's some arguments about these waters. Mostly the idea is that they either came down during the flood in Genesis 7, starting or 6. Anyways, I'm teaching this, I should know what chapter that's in, but that's okay. That they either came down during the flood or soon after. And part of the argument is that there's no rain before the flood. However, we actually don't know that. There could have actually been rain before the flood. Where people get the argument for no rain before the flood is two passages. One is Genesis 2:5. And Genesis 2:5 talks about no rain on the ground yet. But the thing about Genesis 2:5, it's still talking about creation week. It's talking about before man was even created. So if you read it, I'll just read it real quick. When no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. If you look at that, you might as well just say, well, there's no rain before, if you're saying this means there's no rain before the flood, you might as well say, well, there's no farming before the flood, because it's talking about the same idea. So Genesis 2:5 isn't enough to say there's no rain before the flood. The other thing that people talk about is the rainbow. Okay, didn't God place that as a sign after the flood? So if we see rainbows after rain, and there wasn't a rainbow before the flood, then there couldn't have been rain. But when we actually look at the language about the rainbow, God never says that this is the first time it was up there. He's just using it as a sign for his covenant. If you turn to Genesis 9, just to read a couple of verses there, 12 through 14, it says, "And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud. It shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds." Now it says, I've set my bow in the clouds, but it doesn't say it said it right then. And it could be that he's marking it as his covenant. Now, who knows? Maybe there was no rain before the flood. We actually don't know, But here's the other things. This in Genesis 9 is well after the rain stopped. So if God is making a comment about the rainbow, wouldn't Noah and his family have seen it long before while there's still water on the earth? Because there was the 4 days and 4 nights of rain, but then they were in the boat for almost a year while they saw everything, so they would have seen a rainbow then. So it's either there's most likely rain before, and either there was no rainbow then and God put it there at that moment, or, who knows? But there's no proof that there was no rain before the flood, okay? And most likely, they would have seen the rainbow before. It's just God saying, hey, this is now the sign. Not that it wasn't there before, but he's saying, now that you see this, it's the sign. God could have placed the rainbow there right then and there. We don't know. It would have taken God changing the way how light reflected through the water at the time so that they'd cause a rainbow. The rainbows are from the way the water droplets are left in the sky after rain. The sun shines through it and reflects through it and spreads out. Diffraction, or I think that one's diffraction. Anyways, it spreads out, and that's where we see the rainbow. And so, yeah, God could have altered the way light reflected through water, but that seems to be an action that would have taken place. That's an action that's more fit with creation week than something that would happen much later. So most likely Noah and his family had already seen a rainbow, and God was just looking and saying, now this is the sign of my covenant. Whenever you see this from now on, no more flooding the entire earth. But we actually don't entirely know. But what probably happened to this layer in either case is either it was used up a little bit before the flood and then came down during the flood, or it came down during the flood and was finished up being used up a little after it. We don't know, but it came down at some point. Most likely most of it came down during the flood. Okay, so that's the waters. Okay, now the other thing is, well, again, what are we talking about here? The firmament, the atmosphere. Okay, how did God actually create this? We don't know. This is part of Creation Week. He could have done it so many different ways. He could have formed it all around, all over. He could have, just put in the middle, kind of pushing up water some places, water down other places. It could have been like a bubble spreading out throughout the entire earth. We don't know. But again, if we look at the verbs here, the idea of this expanse being thinned out by pounding, it really does describe the atmosphere. So whether it's at one spot and then just kind of thinned out through it all, we do have to realize that the atmosphere is a very thin layer around the earth. We don't really think about it too much, but the atmosphere is only 60 miles thick. That might seem big, but the diameter of the earth is about 8,000 miles. So, and this is for Lefty especially here, if we were to take the earth and shrink it down to the size of a basketball, the atmosphere around that basketball would be the size of about 1/16 of an inch. So that's tiny. That's less than like the grooves that you have in the basketball. You have the little grooves, at different parts come together. It's very spread out. So the idea of this being a firmament, something spread out, is very fitting with the language that we're looking here. Okay. Now, one last thing I just want to note here for day 2. The work of creation on this day and the next 2 days, day 3 and 4, are described in the terms of forming something, not creating from nothing. So day 1, heavens and earth were created from nothing. But day 2 is just matter being shifted around. So for the atmosphere, perhaps the nitrogen, oxygen, and other gases were made from raw protons, neutrons, and electrons here. Or perhaps they're already in that form and just pushed where they should be. But this isn't describing an ex nihilo creation. It's just moving around and shifting what was already there. And that's day 2. There's morning and evening, day 2. All right. I think we're good. We're going to just keep on going through day 3. Okay, we're going to get through 2 days at once. It's awesome. Okay, so day 3. There's 2 significant events on day 3. First is the creation of dry land, and then the second is the creation of vegetation. Okay, I forgot to put it in here, but let's read day 3 real quick. So verse 9 through 13. So it says, "And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which it is their seed, each according to his own kind on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and the trees bearing fruit, which was their seed, each according to their own kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning the 3rd day." Yeah. One quick note on day 2. I forgot to mention this, but again, the expanse was called heaven, but we've already said this is going back. Sorry, I'm a little out of order here, but verse 8 says God called the expanse heaven. The atmosphere. We've already seen that the word heaven can describe both the atmosphere and space and even God's throne room. So calling the expanse heaven isn't saying it has to be outer space. Okay, I just forgot to put that in my notes, but moving on to day 3. So again, 2 big things. Land was created and vegetation. So where does this dry land come from? So again, we know from day 1 the earth was formless and void to start. There was no dry land, and the Spirit was just over the waters. There was a circle drawn over the face of the deep. The waters were separated from the waters below from the firmament. That was day 2. So at this point, there was still nothing but water on the surface of the earth. So the question is, was there at that point earth, land, crust, whatever you want to call it, below the water? We don't actually know. It's never mentioned when the land itself was created. It could have been created at the exact moment that, on day 1. The word earth there is more just talking about the planet than the dry earth. So we actually don't know if it was formed then or if it was formed on day 3, this day, when God says, separate the waters. And we don't know if it was, when it was formed, if it was formed on this day, were the particles already there, or were they, again, did God rearrange the matter of the water into land? He can take the oxygen, hydrogen in the water and create anything he wants from it. But we don't know. But again, most likely the crust was already formed. We don't know. But the idea of this, the words used here is the gathering of waters, not the changing of them. So most likely there was already earth there. Now, I've heard this theory that until day 3, that the earth was really this solution of water. Like there is water throughout the entire earth, and all the stuff we would call earth, land, was actually all dissolved up in it. And so it's this kind of watery solution. And it's an interesting idea. What we call water is never pure water to begin with. Even the water comes from our tap or our bottled water, our filter always has some particles in it, minerals, hopefully, ones we like and not ones we don't like. So the wordage doesn't necessarily exclude that. The biggest problem with that, though, is the actual amount of water on Earth today is actually less than 0.1% of the total mass of Earth. And normally to have things suspended in water, dissolved in water, you need about 50% of it at least to be water. There's some exceptions, but 1% or less than 1% isn't going to be enough to actually dissolve everything. So, yeah, it was probably the crust was already there, formed underneath. It just couldn't be seen because of the waters above. And so, again, God says, let the waters under heavens be gathered together in one place and let dry land appear. So 2 things happening. Dry land or water was gathered. and then dry land appeared. Now the word appeared is just, you see it. I mean, again, it implies that the crust, the thing we'd call land, was already there. It just was hidden under the water. And so the word gathered also implies that, because it talks about taking something and binding it together. It can be used for braiding something, or just gathering it together, like binding something like a sheaf of grain together. So the water was bounded together somehow. Most likely, the parts of the crust that were going to be where the ocean was God pushed down somehow, and the water moved there. And there wasn't enough time for the waters just to go there on their own, so they would have had to have been forcefully gathered. And the reason why I said that there was enough time, well, what happens later that day? Plant life. If God just kind of depressed certain parts of the crust, uplifted other parts, there'd be all this massive water runoff, and what would be left over would be like waterlogged, mucky dirt, and it would not be fit for plant life. So the water was actually gathered forcefully by God to leave behind land where plants can actually thrive. Okay. So that was the first part. Now, when we talk about the waters, we're not saying every droplet, every molecule of water. There would have had to have been enough left in the soil and the land for, again, fertile soil so plants could form. But the ground there would be devoid of enough water to be considered dry and not waterlogged or muddy. Okay. So, let's see. One last thing before we dive into the plants. The dry places were called earth. And this is the same term used in Genesis 1:1. And then the waters were called seas. So, and the seas is plural, so it's not saying, even though the language is gathered together in one place, it still just kind of means we're separating out so that land can be there. So the term earth, though, is interesting, because the term earth is used in Genesis 1:1, heavens and the earth, and now it's used for the idea of dry land. And everywhere in Genesis 1, this term earth is used. It's the same term. The only time it's used differently is when it's talking about dry land, because dry land is actually a single word. And so therefore it's its own term, unrelated to the other word for earth used in Genesis. So the question becomes, if the earth was formless and void while it was still covered in water, why are we now just calling the dry land earth? Isn't it we're talking about two different things here? Well, we have to look at it this way. The earth is what's being prepared for man. It's the place where man is going to inhabit. So at each stage of creation, God is preparing more and more for man. So the whole earth being called earth, okay, that makes sense, is where man's going to inhabit. But where is he really going to inhabit? The dry land. And so that's why we can say, okay, both the earth is, in Genesis 1:1, is talking about everything there, but also God talks about the dry land as being earth specifically. Okay, so it's where man's going to dwell. It's where God's preparing for man to dwell. Okay, now on to the plants. Okay, now this is interesting. Now, first of all, there's 3 categories listed for the plants. Depending on how your Bible translated, it can be vegetation. I think mine, it's vegetation, plants yielding seed, and trees bearing fruit. And this isn't supposed to be taxonomic. It's not supposed to be a scientific breaking down of categories. Remember, the Bible is not trying to be explicit and precise with the science, okay? Everything in it should follow scientific truths, or should match with what we know about science, but it's not being specific in its language, okay? However, if we look at these terms, it's just 3 broad categories to talk about plant life, okay? Grasses or vegetation would include anything that's kind of covering the ground. Again, mine translated as plants yielding seed. Some talk about herbs. These would include pretty much probably bushes, shrubs, And then the trees would include any woody type plants. It says trees bearing fruits in their season. It doesn't have to be fruit trees. We can look at the other trees and like the pine trees, talking about that. Yeah, we wouldn't call that fruit, but it's still the seeds for the trees, so that's fine. Okay, now there's two big things to note with the creation of the plant life. First of all, they were created fully grown. And by created, I mean by the end of day 3, not initially, because it does say that the earth brought forth vegetation or sprouted vegetation. But by the end of day 3, these are fully grown. Okay? And what this means is by the end of day 3, there were plants that were less than hours old, that appeared to be years or even decades or even centuries old. And this is interesting to note when we talk about creation, because some of the concerns about creation for believers are the apparent age of the earth. And apparent is the right term. Anyone who would walk around at the end of day 3 would look at these plants and say that they had been there for years, months, years, centuries. They would not believe that they had been made earlier that day. And we know that there are parts of creation that seem older based upon how we look at it. But we can trust that's still made in 6 days. We can't confuse apparent age with actual age. Now, when we do this, though, we can't just make it blanketly. We can't just say, well, God created it that way. We should always look into why. We should always be looking for the actual explanation, not just saying, well, God made it that way, so whatever. Because God made this universe for us to dwell in and to learn about, and that helps us learn more about Him. So we should examine why something is made this way or that way. Okay? Some of them will be explained by saying, hey, God made it in 6 days, so it's going to have to be older or going to look older than it has to be. But there are other things we will see in other places, other reasons why it is made like this. And this isn't a deception. Some claim that if God made things to appear older than they were, then He's being deceptive in doing so. But in reality, we have to see the purpose. Why is God doing it this way? Well, He's preparing a place for man. And some of these processes won't have time in 6 days to complete, so He's having to speed them up supernaturally to complete His purposes. I mean, after all, these plants would have to be in soil that was fertile, ready for them. That soil, in other times, would take years of, microbes and everything in them to get to the right conditions. But these ones were made in moments so that plants could actually live in them. So it's not just the plants that would have this apparent age. Even the earth, the soil, would look far older than it actually would by the end of that day. Now, the second thing to note with the plants is the phrase, according to its own kind. Now, the word kind is used mostly in the books of law, talking about different kinds of creatures. And just like that, kinds of creatures. The one thing we need to make sure is that the word kind does not get confused with our modern word species. They are very different things. Even in modern times, the word species is not well defined in scientific terms. The most widely used definition that I could find is a group of animals or plants that can mate and produce viable offspring. However, when we see that the word species getting thrown around a lot, it's not often, not always, not usually using that definition. For instance, tigers and lions are different species. However, tigers and lions can actually produce offspring. And while the males are usually sterile, the females of such unions have actually gone on to produce more offspring with other tigers or lions. So in our today's society, we'd call those separate species, but we can actually produce viable offspring from them. White rhinoceroses are divided into 2 subspecies, but often when they're talked about as separate species. And so what we actually mean by the word species, it depends on who you're talking to. But it raises the question, if God says that the plants here and later creatures are to reproduce according to their own kind, where does the diversification we see in the world come from? Is that actually evolution in play? Is that we're seeing the microevolution, which means that macroevolution is probably viable? Now, when we talk about evolution, macro or micro, it talks about new information being added to the genome of a creature in the form of mutations. And this information is used to make different proteins in the different cells, and so those cells can be used for different purposes, and it alters the species. But when we actually look at how life works, we don't actually see that. And the reason why is DNA. And DNA is an amazing thing. If you ever study DNA, you will get blown away by all the amazing things of it, and I don't have time to go through them all. So let's talk about DNA. First of all, we do see mutations in DNA, but we don't often see it adding information. In fact, almost rarely. It's like having an error in a computer file and then thinking that that new corrupted file has more, or at least different information than you had before. If you open up a corrupted Word document, you're going to get gibberish. You're not going to get a new essay, and new insights into things. And we've talked a bit about how complicated cells are back in lesson 2. Mutations in DNAs are not enough to explain how these large, complex, and interactive structures in cells actually came about. So the mutations don't really explain the new information. So how do we get these new species? How does a wolf turn into hundreds of breeds of dogs after a few hundred generations? Now, one explanation you'll see from people, from Christians even, is that when you see dogs and the different breeds of dogs, they're just missing genetic information. The original wolf had so much information in the forms of genes, but some of that information was bred out, and each of these dogs have different parts of that genome in their DNA. And that's partially true. You probably have seen some information, it seems to be going around a lot recently, about how inbreeding dogs, we've done it so much that they're in a state where they're no longer healthy. If you have a purebred dog, chances are it's going to have health issues. And we did this because we breed dogs for certain traits, and usually back in the day we just get those traits and we're happy, but now we just breed those animals in with themselves, so they're inbred. And some of these traits actually become so exaggerated that it's no longer healthy. And then when we see some of these breeds breed together, we get a mutt that's actually healthier than the parents. So, it's interesting. But even this doesn't explain everything. When we look at the elimination of data in the genome, it doesn't explain how certain functions in the cells change. There actually does appear in some ways to be new information in these cells. Where is that actually coming from? Well, again, looking at DNA, we don't actually use all of our DNA all at once. Okay? Our cells use the DNAs as blueprints to make proteins, which make structures in the cell, which tells how these cells are used. But each cell only uses parts of the DNA. And even if we look through an entire organism, it doesn't use all of the DNA. Some of this DNA is bound into these tightly wound structures that never gets used. And for the longest time, we call this junk DNA, because it's like, well, it's not getting used. It must just be, that they use it as proof of evolution because it didn't get used, so it must be this junk left over from these evolutionary mutations. But the more we actually study it, the more we see it has uses. Even the parts that never get directly used as blueprints for proteins and such still have uses. But one of the things we have found is that sometimes these unused portions end up getting used. So the parts that are tightly wound are for some reason unwound and allowed to express themselves in making proteins, which again can alter how these cells function. And we're not entirely sure what causes this, but one of the leading theories is that external environmental pressures can cause the cells to be able to do this. And what that means is that external pressures, external changes to the environment of a creature can cause it to express a gene that hadn't expressed before, but was still already in its DNA. So instead of a mutation being the cause for a change of an animal or plant, it's actually a gene that was already there, just in a dormant state. Now, this is stuff we're still figuring out, so we'll have to actually see how a lot of this information turns out. But we've seen changes in cells that are not tied to mutations, but are changed to this genes. We call it, I just lost the term. It's epigenetics. I think that's what it is. Where it's this change of how the DNA is being used, not changes to the DNA itself. But what this means is that when the Bible is talking about after its own kind, we're not saying that there can't be any changes. We're not saying that there can't even be new species. But what we're saying is that the kind of plant or animal doesn't change. Two frogs from the same parents can in many generations have offsprings that are different species. We'd look at them and say they're different species of frogs. That doesn't mean mutations are being added, or what I should say, that mutations are adding information. Mutations will be present, but we're not saying mutations are adding information. But we're saying one of the things we do say is that frogs won't eventually make a lizard, okay? There's information in the DNA that isn't always being used. And it is limited, though. DNA is not unlimited. So what we're saying is that, yeah, there's this information there that can be expressed in later generations that aren't expressed now, and so we do see changes. But it is limited, and as God's own proclamation says, according to their own kind, it will prevent, a frog becoming a lizard or anything along those lines. So, just because we see changes doesn't mean we're talking about evolution in the Darwinian sense of new mutations adding new information and then natural selection breeding things out. Okay? Natural selection we might agree with. The new mutations causing new things, that's something we disagree with or say it happens so rarely it couldn't explain what we see today. Okay. Now, one last thing. We're almost done, so don't worry. One last thing. This came back to what we talked about a few weeks ago with long day creation. If we look at day 3, all the kinds of plants were made on day 3, but no animals were made yet. And this contradicts what evolutionists say happened. So what evolutionists say happened is, there were some plants that were formed, and then some animals that were formed, and then other plants were formed much later. And namely, fruit trees were added much later, according to evolutionists. And so even if we want to use long day creation to explain things, it doesn't match with what evolution says, and so it's not really appeasing anything. Also, there were no insects on day 3, and many plants need insects to get pollinated. So a long day would not make sense in that context as well. Okay, these plants would still need supernatural assistance to grow. And that's day 3. There's evening and there's morning, day 3. Okay, so we're going to leave off here. All right, next week we'll do day 4. I'll probably just get through day 4. I might get through day 5. We'll see. But one thing for homework for you guys, real quick. Read through day 4 and ask yourself, what words does God not use to describe his creation that day that we commonly use to describe it today? So what words are absent in this that we would normally attribute to here? And why do you think God didn't use those words? Well, we'll talk about that next week. All right, until then.